Good afternoon. My name is Eugene Yapp. I'm one of the panel speakers for the session. We are God's Story in Malaysia. I'd like to thank Malaysian Care for giving me this invitation as one of the panel speakers and also for organizing this integral mission conference, which is an important subject for Christians and the church to address. Allow me to give you a few words of introduction regarding myself. I'm the former Secretary General of NCF Malaysia. Now I am the National Unity Program Director for UID Sejahtera. UID Sejahtera is the project arm or vehicle of Gabungan Bertindak Malaysia, popularly known as GBM, a coalition of some 27 civil society organizations working on societal issues in Malaysia. I'm also the Senior Fellow of the Religious Freedom Institute, which has its base office in Washington, D.C., and a member of the Council of International Experts on International Religious Freedom. Before we proceed, let's look at some of the trends that are affecting the social religious landscape in Malaysia. One of the most important and contentious issues right now relating to the social religious landscape in Malaysia is the issue of national unity, what we call perpaduan and religious diversity, kepelbagaian bangsa dan agama. These two issues affect the wider society in terms of the relationship and how we relate to one another. We have a situation or a relationship between cordial versus animosity, understanding versus prejudice, hate against love, segmented or diversity. It also affects what we call the local community living at the grassroots. In the living environment with neighbors more particularly, the relationship range between peaceful coexistence and versus enmity, togetherness or separation versus solidarity. These are some of the trends that are now debated and very much in contention when we talk about national unity and religious diversity. So the question here is, what is God's story for us in the light of these trends? What can we, as the people of God, really do in the light of these trends? I'd like to share with you my personal story, and I call it Making a Difference. So my story is about trying to make a difference, a story in international, regional, and local advocacy. Firstly, it is engagement at the United Nations, trying to advocate issues of religious diversity, religious freedom at the UN. Then there's also attending at the various ministerial events. This picture that you see is at the Ministerial to Advance International Religious Freedom at Washington, D.C., very important event for the last 2 years. This is at the ASEAN Parliamentarian for Human Rights dialogue session, where we engage the MPs of various nations. So in this picture here, you have some of our MPs, YB Charles and YB Customary. Aside from the advocacy issues, I also try to make a difference in terms of bringing reconciliation efforts on issues of race, religion, and national unity. What are they? This was a meeting with our previous former Minister of Perpaduan National Unity, YP Wetamuti. This was at the event of a consultation that we held relating to the formation of a Reconciliation Commission for Malaysia. This was with YB Mujahid Rawat, also the former Minister of Agama, and we met him also to discuss on the formation of the Reconciliation Commission for Malaysia. This was at a meeting at the Jabatan Perpaduan Negara dan Integrasi Nasional, the JPNIN. JPNIN is an agency that is in charge of the implementation of policies on national unity. So this was a meeting held in conjunction with trying to organize a hate speech seminar, working group. And this meeting is at what they call the Institute of Ethnic Study in UKM, University Kebangsaan Malaysia in Bangi. The gentleman on my right here is Professor Samso. He is now the National Advisor or the right-hand advisor to the Minister of National Unity, Perpaduan, the current Minister of National Unity. So we had a talk on him to discuss on some policy implementation matters. This is with our current Minister of Agama, the former Mufti of Wilayah Persekutuan, YB Zulkifli Bakri. This was at a meeting at his office to discuss on various issues relating to religious freedom and the affairs of Agama on Islam. I also am involved in trying to make a difference at the community empowerment level and bringing national unity to local communities. Here we work with several partners. We have on my right, MyPJ, on my left, Friends of Kota Damansara. And our tagline is community. At the center there is the logo Love, Kerajaan Prihatin. So that's our tagline of what we do when it comes to community empowerment. And our scope, our work is from community to state to nation. This is a little bit of an emphasis on our team. It's called Community Prihatin, and our tagline is this: Selamat, Harmoni, Mampan, safe, harmonious, livable. So what do we do in terms of the safe, harmonious, livable in community empowerment? Let's look at some photos. These are the areas that we are involved in. About 8-9 areas. These are all what we call the local PPR community. Most of them are below bottom 40%, the B40 community, in terms of the poverty line. We try to make change by bringing better living environment to the people. When we got into some of these communities, what we found was that the living conditions there are really bad. This is at the lift area, and you can see all the very dirty and stain marks on the wall because of the bad living conditions. So what we did was we organized with the corporates to try to clean this area by repainting some of these common areas in the flats. And after repainting, you will see this. Another vision of it. And this effort was even recognized and was taken note by the newspaper and the media. Over at PPR Kota Damansara, we did not do painting. We organized what we call community gardens. So we collaborated with the corporates as well as the local community to have what we call gardens. And these are vegetable gardens. So much so that even our partners was awarded an award for this effort. We hold National Unity Roundtable discussion to discuss conflict resolutions, personal tensions within the community, within the residents there. We have economic resilience programs, soup kitchen, entrepreneurship, and our entrepreneurship is also in partnership with Food Panda. Now, the question here is, why is it important for Christians to be part of this work? Reverend Christopher Wright has brought to us 3 points: building the church, serving the society, and creation care. I would like to add another feature. And this is based on a contextual model of the situation, more specifically in Malaysia. I would like to add the element of peaceful coexistence, which is made up of social inclusion, cohesion, based on unity in diversity, in line with the UN Agenda 2030 on Sustainable Development Goal number 16. And you may ask me, what is the biblical basis for this? The verses are there. And it's simply this: God is with us, that He came that we might have life abundantly. So we have now been entrusted with the ministry of reconciliation. And our role, the ministry of reconciliation, peace on earth, goodwill, harmonious well-being to men, taken from Luke chapter 2, verse 14. Where do we start? Very simple, with the acronym RST. Realize the church does not build the kingdom of God. We merely participate in God's mission. Search. Look at avenues in addition to beyond the church. This is not to say that serving the church is not important. Search beyond the church. And then T for try. Try civil society, interfaith engagement in community engagement for empowerment and transformation. We take a multi-pronged approach. Some of you may ask, what are some areas that I can be involved in? And this little diagram represents the many facets and many aspects of work in community empowerment, national unity, perpaduan that you can get involved in. So many of them here: governance, physical environment, even work attitude, empowerment, parenting, family life. So in community empowerment, it is based on a multi-dimensional multilateral perspective, which all of us can get involved. And the church, the people of God, have the various gifts and talents for us to get involved in many or all of this area. And at the end of the day, what we really want and what we really seek is a servanthood attitude. I quote from the great reformer, the US civil rights activist, Dr. Martin Luther King, who says, "He who is greatest among you shall be a servant." That's the new definition of greatness. By giving that definition of greatness, it means that everybody can be great because everybody can serve. And the verse is Matthew 23, verse 11. "He that is greatest among you shall be your servant." So servanthood, and this is what we in UID Sejahtera, it's all about. I hope you have enjoyed this presentation and inspired by the service and the need for servanthood as part of God's story, making a difference in society in Malaysia right now. Thank you.
Good afternoon, brothers and sisters. It's a privilege to be speaking to you today, and I want to thank Micah Malaysia for this opportunity. I'm Audrey, and my background is in refugee resettlement and migrant trafficking. I started off with helping refugees in Malaysia resettle to the United States, and then helping victims of trafficking to return to their home countries. To understand migration more and how to help migrant workers, I did a Master's in Migration Studies. Currently, I work with the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, or IFRC. I monitor and evaluate Red Cross and Red Crescent programs in the Asia and the Pacific region by measuring how well our aid is helping people. Apart from COVID-19 work, our largest program now is in the refugee camp in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh, where we have been providing help such as safe water and basic healthcare, among other things, to 260,000 people for more than 4 years. Today, I'll be giving you an overview of some of the vulnerabilities that migrant communities face in Malaysia and how they are an important part of God's story. Before I begin, I'd like to clarify that there are differences between asylum seekers and refugees, trafficked persons, documented migrants, and undocumented migrants. But for the purposes of this talk, I will speak about vulnerable migrants regardless of legal status, with some focus on migrant workers. When I use the phrase vulnerable migrants, I mean non-citizens residing in Malaysia who are in need and not protected by our government welfare system. They aren't able to, for example, go to the hospital because the foreigner rate is too expensive, or they live in hiding after running away from their abusive employer because their passports were confiscated and they are now deemed illegal. Now, what are some of the recent challenges they are facing? The most recent challenge would certainly have to be COVID-19. Last June, we conducted a first round of survey of Malaysians' perception of COVID-19. In a sample of 2012 Malaysians across the country, we found that more than 2/3 believe that a specific group is responsible for spreading COVID-19. Many of them quoted foreigners, immigrants, and foreign workers, among others, as responsible for the spread. This may not be surprising or new to you, because we've seen the negative perception of Malaysians towards migrants long before COVID-19 hit us. The pandemic just brought to light and worsened existing stigma. We saw this during the 2015 Andaman Sea crisis, where boats with stranded Rohingyas fleeing persecution were pushed back out to sea by Malaysia. And we certainly saw this again more recently as COVID-19 cases increased among migrant communities. Many NGOs and international organizations are advising our government to address this stigma because COVID-19 knows no nationality or legal status. While many Malaysians are suffering with loss of health and jobs, migrants are also suffering, and on top of that, they live in fear without any safety nets and rights that many Malaysians are offered. We saw this with the government's response of increased detention and deportation of migrants starting around mid of last year, which further forced many migrants to go into hiding. Now, what are some of the common myths about migrants? There are exponentially more myths than I can cover, but for today, I'd like to focus on just 6. Migrant workers earn very good money here and will be rich when they return. Many migrant workers, in fact, take a loan in order to pay the large agent fees to get here. If they are unable to afford the fees, their employer would pay the sum and take a cut out of their salaries. When I was working in IOM with victims of trafficking, I've heard from migrants that their employers will not pay them for months, sometimes to a year, just to cover the agent fees. Many are promised by agents good money when they move here for work, But once they realize the promises are but empty promises, it's too late. They are trapped in the work to pay off their debt, even in exploitative work conditions. Many are ashamed to return home and face their families, and running away will risk turning their status into illegal migrant. Number 2, it's unrealistic to help everyone. Why don't we just help Malaysians first? Now the myth here is that helping migrants means not helping Malaysians, and vice versa. Migrants are actually helping Malaysians by growing an economy. The reality is that our economy is very labor intensive and require a workforce that many Malaysians are not interested in participating. For example, last year there was a lot of push for Malaysians to work at the Pasar Borong, replacing migrant laborers. But what we see is that Malaysians employers prefer migrants because Malaysians aren't cut out to work long hours in labor-intensive conditions. Placing Malaysians' interests first and protecting migrants does not have to be mutually exclusive. This can be a win-win situation. Protection of migrants can attract good labor and grow an economy. Number 3, migrants are a threat to society. Yes, there are migrants who break the law, as there are Malaysians who do as well. It's unfair to paint a broad brush that because some migrants break the law, hence they are all a threat to society. For this myth, there is also an underlying fear of migrants changing our culture here. That is heavily dependent on our perception of the type of migrant. We certainly do not treat high-skilled expats and low-skilled migrants equally, with the latter being likely more to be considered a threat. Number 4, undocumented migrants are breaking the law. The government should be detaining and deporting them. I agree that undocumented migrants who overstay and do not have proper documentation did break the immigration law. But I think we need to view this beyond the law because there are flaws in our immigration system, and some punishment in the eyes of the law is not true justice. For example, when undocumented migrants are detained, they are placed in absolutely horrendous and inhumane living conditions, awaiting deportation that may take days or sometimes years. Is that justice? We should first address the reasons of their lack of documentation. Sometimes it's because they fled from their employers who withhold their passports. Or take asylum seekers who fled due to persecution. Returning could mean facing death. And even in cases when they enter into Malaysia illegally, shouldn't there be more humane ways of treating them than our current detention and deportation system? We shouldn't just have one blanket system for all migrants. Number 5, shutting borders will stop migration. If you look at data from other countries that have increased border restrictions, the migration flow does not stop. Those who want to enter will turn to smugglers and traffickers. Instead, restrictions affect circular migration, which is when migrants move temporarily to work and then return home often multiple times. Most migration in Malaysia is circular migration, and when restrictions increase, migrants who are within the country will tend to overstay for fear of being unable to return. Number 6, offering more rights to migrants will encourage more to come. When choosing to migrate, most migrants tend to choose countries with higher wages, close to their home countries, and where there is already a community of their own countrymen. Usually, it is not based on whether they get better welfare rights based on evidence. In fact, countries that restrict welfare rights for migrants will likely worsen their social and economic integration into the local society, leading to more need and claims for welfare. Now, you must be thinking, why should we even be involved? The reality is that there are more than 2 million documented migrants and a further 2 to 4 million undocumented migrants in Malaysia. These are all people created in God's image, just like you and I. When we see the suffering of migrants, it is done at the hands of sinners like you and me. God has redeemed us from sin and evil, and we are now able to live as free people. And He wants to redeem all of creation. Ultimately, the gospel is the solution for suffering, and all Christians are commissioned to bring the saving knowledge to all people. If you believe all this to be true, suffering migrants are also part of God's redeeming plan. We serve a God who is just, a God who executes justice for the fatherless and the widow. As God's image bearers, we are called to follow in Jesus' footsteps, and Jesus identifies Himself with His followers who are the poor, the imprisoned, the hungry, and the naked, and says that to neglect people is to neglect Him. We should also remember the words in James, which says, "Faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead." Now, how can you and your church get involved? First of all, this is something that we can all do. Don't spread misinformation and hate speech, especially during this high-tension COVID-19 season. As Christians, we still have differing opinions on treatment of migrants. It's best to have truthful and loving conversations with people lest we sin against one another and against God. Number 2, while COVID-19 has brought out some of the worst in us, it has also brought out some of the best. It's been especially encouraged to see the care shown by our communities made up of everyday Malaysians. We heard and saw a lot of them at the beginning of the pandemic, and while this may have scaled down now, it still continues. For example, I know a couple in my church who continues to help refugees in need of medical help, food, childcare, and others. They've been partnering with the people at my church to raise funds to continue supporting refugee families in need. And in the process, they've been able to share the gospel with some who have yet to know Christ. There are folks like this everywhere. You could start small by joining forces with them, and you can of course volunteer with organizations already working with migrants. And lastly, if you would like to be involved in long-term change, you should advocate through your community representatives such as your Ardents and MPs. While better legislation is not the solution, it is still an important change. I know there are Ardents and MPs that are particularly vocal about this, but more people need to be involved for there to be change. And how can churches support this work? First of all, pray, pray, pray. It's so important to submit all this to God because we are His workers and He's ultimately in control. Why not incorporate this as a praying point at your next prayer meeting? I also know some faith-based organizations that partner with local churches to pray. Next, of course, provide welfare support. You may think that migrants can access help from NGOs and international organizations such as UNHCR, but there really is not enough aid to fully address the great need. Many migrants are in extreme need for basics. I see the church play a large role here in providing welfare where there is extreme need and our government isn't doing enough. How this looks like can vary from efforts such as the one led by the couple at my church, or it can grow into a more structured ministry. In closing, I'd like to share this quote which talks about justice in our care for the vulnerable and marginalized. Our end goal is not the redistribution of wealth, nor is our ultimate hope placed in the ability of our government to change its legislation. Rather, we speak and act against injustice, not in an attempt to create a utopian society, but in the spirit and power effort to point to the true utopian society to come. This was the aim of our Saviour during His ministry on earth. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm pleased and honored to have been invited to speak on Native customary rights, a subject that's close to my heart as an Indigenous person. I will narrow this down to look at Native customary lands, and as the term suggests, this is about rights of Native peoples. In Malaysia, Indigenous peoples in Sabah and Sarawak are called natives, and in Peninsular Malaysia, they are Orang Asli. The natives and Orang Asli are part of a global community of indigenous peoples or original inhabitants that span the 5 continents. They form 6% of the global population and share similar histories and experience of repression, injustice, inequality, and forced displacement from their lands and loss of access to their ancestral territories. And this results in vulnerability, powerlessness, extreme poverty, and despair. Despite their diversity, the thread that weaves indigenous communities together is their common strong attachment to their lands. Their identity and the psyche is intertwined with the lands on which they live. Question is, why land? Because land symbolizes power, self-sufficiency, and legacy. And we see that the sentiment of indigenous peoples the world over and their declaration on their inheritance is very similar, where they speak of land as life. And they say, this is our land, this is our life, land is our livelihood. Our ancestors have lived here for generations. It has always been so. This could be a statement made by an Orang Asli leader or a native leader or any indigenous person in any part of the world. Indigenous peoples have often stressed that land is not only the basis of their economic livelihood, but it is the basis of their cultural and social identity and heritage. And so it is always a bewilderment for them when they find that the law in the states that they live in have given limited recognition to their lands. There's generally a collision between the notion of land ownership based on indigenous or native laws and customs and based on their oral traditions. Their indigenous land ownership is a communal or a collective right, as well as an individual right that is sourced in customary laws. Whereas the state's basis of land ownership is land that is based on a registration of documentary title, which is an individual right. An example, as you can see in the Sarawak, they say all lands without title belongs to the state. In fact, when we see the definition of law in Malaysia, it includes customs and usage having the force of law. And indigenous peoples have claimed rights to their lands under custom and usage. One example, as we can see, is the Iban Pemakai Menua. They talk about territorial boundaries between village communities marked by natural features like rivers and hills. Within that territory, they have cultivated lands. They have their farms and gardens and fruit groves and formerly cultivated lands that are left to fallow to increase the fertility of the land. They have their old longhouse sites, they have their cemetery and burial grounds within that territory, and they keep a forest preserve for communal use, which they call the pulau. And so you have that customary practice among the indigenous peoples, not just the Iban, but other native communities as well. So indigenous peoples have resorted to the courts to fight for their rights. And with some measure of success, we see that the courts have declared that natives and Orang Asli have customary title to their lands. In the last 20 years, we see that the courts have made some positive declarations on that, although government policies have been slow to catch on. For example, the federal court in Madali bin Saleh specifically held that common law respects the pre-existence of rights under native laws and customs, and that native customary rights is not created by statute, it is something that is pre-existing. In recent years, we see the pendulum seem to be swinging back, as it were, in the recent decision of the case of Tuairo Masanda versus Director of Forest. Their natives have claimed rights in some forest areas which is not cultivated. They claim it as their pulau. But the federal court held that native custom of Pemakai Menua and pulau does not have the force of law. The land must be cleared and cultivated. This has been contested very much by the natives. And in response to the case, the Sarawak Land Code was amended in 2018 to provide the creation of communal lands with title. This is a statutory title that is based on statute. And this is the position now, as we see in the case of, as decided by Tuairo Masanda, the latest position. We are yet to see how the courts will further decide. Indigenous peoples continue to face challenges on lands that they occupy. For example, there are limited statutory recognition of their customary lands. We see as an example, the Aboriginal Peoples Act declares that Orang Asli are only tenants at will on lands that they occupy, even if it is on gazetted reserve lands. And of course, we see illegal timber logging that affects their lands, building of large hydroelectric dams, displacing local communities that are on the land, joint ventures and lease of lands to large companies for tree plantations or oil palm plantations, affecting native customary land rights inside the lease areas. And of course, as has often happened, development or resettlement programs without proper consultations with the local people. Now, there are efforts that are made by indigenous peoples themselves with regard to their lands, of course, to lobby for proper recognition of their rights under their own native law and customs. There is a move for conservation of lands and forest by indigenous peoples for community conserved areas and forest parks, which may be co-managed by indigenous communities for sustainable development. And they lobby for support for sustainable protection of their environment. But one thing that they have really asked for, or that they need support for, is development of their own lands for sustainable livelihood. And so perhaps these are areas that we can participate in living God's story and to break the cycle of poverty and despair among the communities. One of the first things, of course, is by prayer. Praying for reform of legal structures and policies and praying for those responsible for lawmaking. Secondly, practical engagement and economic empowerment. Engagement through advocacy, getting alongside communities to help them understand their rights and giving a voice to those who are not able to speak for themselves. And in your various spheres of influence, provide encouragement, economic empowerment of the communities through education, through training, to create livelihoods, developing life skills that will sustain the rural young people, and to plant hope by providing alternative education and alternative livelihood programs, for example, for smallholder farms. There are examples of programs that are done to empower indigenous peoples, indigenous communities. I can think of the National Economic Empowerment Conference, which is an interchurch organization with a focus on economic empowerment of natives and Orang Asli. Setting up a social enterprise, in this case is called Impact Makers, to help farmers, giving them channels to market their products. I can also talk about OA Organics as an example in Peninsular Malaysia, where their tagline is making businesses work for the poor. They partner with Orang Asli families for establishing organic farms and to increase household incomes for families that are involved and to make them equity owners. And these are just some examples that we can emulate to create livelihoods for the local communities. It is in reaching out and being part of God's extended hand that we are living God's life. Thank you.
To Eugene, to Audrey, and to Professor Ramy for your presentations. But also thank you very much for the work that each of you does in your respective areas in respect of bringing God's message closer to the community. We have a fair number of questions. And we have about half an hour in which to get through, well, at least some of them. I want to start with a broad question, which I would pose to all three of you. And it goes something like this. What social, racial, and economic demographics is the church in Malaysia mostly found in your view? And how has this shaped the way in which the church has understood its role and participation in God's story in Malaysia? Perhaps we'll for ease, we'll keep to the order that the presentations were made. So maybe Eugene, you might want to say something first about this. It's a broad question.
Yes. I think we can't go into much of details, but generally it can be divided into, say, a very general description is the north, east, west, south Now, over at the west, of course, and I'm saying this because I'm looking at it more from the NECF churches, being the ex-secretary general. If you look at the west coast of Peninsula, you will see that the demographics will be the upper middle class, higher economic status, more Chinese, more Indians. As you move towards the what you call the north, then you will have the poorer, smaller churches. And then at the East Coast, you will have what is called very small churches. In fact, they are really the minority of minority, confining mainly to Chinese and some Indian churches, and of course the Orang Asli churches. So really at the center of Malaysia Peninsula, the Pahang area will be actually, Perak going to the Pahang area will be more the Orang middle class, but mainly confined to Chinese, Indian. So this demographics will be very different, say, for example, in East Malaysia, Sabah, Sarawak. It's too wide to describe because even in Sabah, Sarawak, the city churches is very different from, let's say, the semi-interior, and then the semi-interior and the city churches is very different from, say, the what you call the rural interior churches.
Yeah, but I suppose, Eugene, I think the question, again, if I can just reiterate it to the other two who have not yet answered, how does this shape our sort of like missional understanding of what the church is being called to do? I mean, so I suppose in a very crude way, you know, are urban churches really looking at urban issues and they don't really care? And then for Prof. Ramy, you know, if it's an urban church, do we not understand, say, the significance of land to the Orang Asli and the Orang Asal and how this has its own theological underpinnings? I think that's really the question that the questioner was trying to get at.
Yeah, maybe I can just quickly say my piece as well. So I think that definitely that's very true. I mean, Eugene gave a very good overview of the different demographic groups. And I think that at least based on what I see with the churches in Klang Valley, a lot of it is very much focusing on this demographics that are very similar to us. And so even within the urban area, I think it's not just urban versus rural sort of dichotomy, but it's also within the urban areas. I think in terms of people with different language groups, people of different ethnicities, I think there are barriers in that sense. And I think what we are most comfortable in terms of personal evangelism, in terms of sharing this gospel to people, we're very comfortable with sharing people who are our peers, who are of the same background, but we often find there are barriers with people of another language and another ethnic group. And I think that is a gap, and that's something that that a lot of churches, I mean, some churches are really looking into it, but perhaps not as much as you hope. Yeah.
Prof. Ramy?
Yeah, perhaps I will answer this in the question that you have on the top there. In terms of Orang Asli or Orang Asal identifying themselves as Christians, I think the theology of land, for example, lands and land is a really important thread that runs through the Bible, not just a physical place, but it also speaks of land as a place where God dwells. And I think indigenous peoples instinctively know this, that they have a place where they've been given this place as the original inhabitants. And they're, as we can see, God often speaks of giving land. He called Abraham out to a land which he will give him. The people of God are called out to a promised land, and then there are injunction for them to possess the land. I think indigenous peoples do have an instinctive, as I said, knowledge of their place in the land. But again, whether they connect that to their role in terms of the church, there is a growing, shall I say, there is a growing recognition, I think, of their place as God's people, to be the ones perhaps to really stand and claim the land for the Lord. But that's there's a general comment that I can make But I think they represent very much people who are an exploited minority, in some way repressed. And there needs to be a bit more creation of awareness in people in the rural areas. I think sometimes we are so detached because we don't really see the importance of this to people in the rural areas whose lives are dependent on the land. So there needs to be a bit more creation of that awareness, I think, in the urban churches. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Ramy, and I hope to have some time to be able to come back to that issue more in depth. Now, I just want to focus perhaps to some individual questions that have been posed on the specific areas that we've been talking about. And Eugene, you get, I think, the lion's share of some of the questions here. And maybe I would like to just group them a little bit and to preface them by reminding our audience that at least in Malaysia, the government has recently launched its National Unity Blueprint for the nation. So I'm going to sort of combine a couple of questions. So there's one question here, Eugene. What do you think about the church's overall response towards national unity and engagement with religious diversity?
Now, generally, in terms of the church's response to national unity and religious diversity, the churches have been traditionally been involved in interfaith dialogues. They've been going on for years, 15, 20 years and all. However, much of these interfaith dialogues are actually usually at the level that they talk about more of the broader, very general issues, and perhaps what some people say the nice issue, the nice uncontestable issue. But I think with COVID and some of the recent situations that we're having, we are again seeing that many people, particularly more, not so much churches, but I think individual Christians who are making the effort to move beyond the nice, cursory, general issues to the more contestable issues. I think these are not so much groups or churches, but maybe more individuals who are trying to make a difference by engaging in national issues, religious diversity across the board with the other. This is still a small number, but it's growing.
Okay, thanks, Eugene. Audrey, the next question is for you. And again, I would preface this question by saying that, you know, the Bible really speaks to Christians as being people who should be different from normal or ordinary society. We should, you know, be in some ways counter-cultural. So this question is quite interesting with regards to perceptions about vulnerable migrants. Is there much distinction between the perceptions within the church and outside the church? So is there really any difference in how Christians see migrants as opposed to non-Christians? And if not, what aspect of God's story needs to be more deeply reflected by the Malaysian church, and what are the barriers to doing so?
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, it's a very interesting question. And I would say, I mean, this is not backed by data. This is just, I guess, my perception of this, and also perceptions, particularly of the church in Malaysia, and particularly Klang Valley. So I would say that I think I've had conversations about migrants, of course, with Christians and non-Christians in Malaysia, and I would say that sometimes they're very similar conversations, and of course there are folks that are, you know, on either side, in both camps, right? And I think that one thing that if you look in the scripture, of course, one maybe particular distinction that is some Christians back their perception on is perhaps in Galatians, where Paul tells us to do good to all people, you know, especially our household, right, our family, meaning Christians, right? So there are preferences, I suppose, with Christians in that they would want to be doing more good to Christian refugees or Christian migrants, and I understand why. But there's also another aspect of this, right? That when it comes to bringing the gospel to all nations, I would say that, you know, there is an importance of bringing the gospel and being able to care for non-Christians as well, and to be able to share the gospel with them, right? But I also understand that in terms of approachability with Christians, in terms of caring for them, there's I guess less of a barrier there. And so in terms of what aspects that should be more deeply reflected by the Malaysian Church, I believe that we really, if you want to look into scripture and we want to really look into the Great Commission, we can't deny that there is a call from God to bring this to all nations, right? Bring the gospel to all nations and teaching them and discipling them. That should be backing up all the actions or all the beliefs of the Malaysian Church. And there is also a lot of emphasis on caring for the sojourners or foreigners, and so I think that in the Malaysian Church, in terms of our actions and our preaching as well, should be reflected. And I think some of the barriers could be, for example, I was talking about how perhaps Christians would be emphasizing more on caring for fellow Christians or even fellow Malaysians. Sometimes the passage are even, I guess, generalized more or applying more to Malaysian Christians rather than Christians in general. So I think that would be something that I think at the top of my mind. Yeah.
But Audrey, can I be a little bit provocative and push you a little bit on that? Isn't there to some extent a hypocrisy within the church that we talk about wanting to take care of migrants and people in precarious positions, but then when I listen sometimes to stories about how Christian families talk about their domestic workers, I don't see a difference. I see Christian families treating their domestic workers just as badly as a non-Christian family. So where's the example of Christianity in those situations? Or for example, Christian employers with respect to their employees.
Yeah, no, that's the way. I think it kind of applies to what you were asking in the beginning as well, right? In terms of our socio economic backgrounds and how that kind of informs our lives, our Christian living as well. And I think that is definitely a gap there. There's something really true about that. And not just you, I think a lot of people also agree that when it comes to treatment of employees or treatment of their helpers at home, there is that distinction. And I think that the interesting thing is they don't see it that way. I think they don't see that, that is an opportunity for gospel, or that is an opportunity for them to be showing, to be living out their Christian values as God commanded to these people. And so, yeah, definitely, I completely agree. And I think that it is really the conviction of God, of the Holy Spirit on these people. And also, I think at the same time, we ourselves, rather than, I guess, pointing fingers at these people, I think we ourselves also need to be living that out. And I think that modeling behavior, modeling good behavior is also very important. We don't really highlight these issues because we think that, it's someone that we don't want to be the ones that are judging others, right? But I think it's important to be able to see this sort of what does a good employer look like, or what does a caring for your helper look like, because we're so used to having these conversations with non-Christians and with people that they feel like it is their right, because I have paid thousands of ringgit to bring this person, and so therefore it's right for them to be working 24 hours for me, even in the middle of the night. I think even growing up in my own family, I would had that perception. But in fact, if you look at this person as an employee, as someone who is, created in God's image, and as someone who should have fixed work hours and have rest days and all these things, it doesn't come to us immediately. And I think it's definitely something that not talked about a lot. Maybe actually in recent times a bit more, I would say. So I do see a trend moving in that direction, which is good. But definitely a lot more that we ourselves, instead of looking into legislation, instead of looking into all these things, we ourselves as Christians, how are we living in our Monday to Saturday and going to worship God on Sunday, but really the hypocrisy really is very clear on other days. Yeah.
Thank you, Audrey. Prof. Ramy, sort of a similar question to you. I mean, I think Christians have been quite at the forefront of creation care and wanting to talk about ecological sustainability and environmental sensitivity and things like that. But do you think that the Malaysian church overall in Malaysia understands those issues in the context of indigenous communities in this country?
Do I think whether the Malaysian church understands that in the context of indigenous people?
Yes.
I think there is a growing understanding, I think, but in this question that you're saying, are the natives and Orang Asli themselves, are they leading in terms of this,
Well, I mean, you you can say yes. Are they leading? But I'm also saying that I mean, in some of the cases where I think we've seen, there's outreach to a Orang Asli or indigenous community. We go, we teach Sunday school, or we do charitable works. But do we understand the more fundamental issues that they are facing, and do we actually champion them the way that we quite easily champion overall, green technology, global ecological sustainability, that sort of thing? Is there a mismatch somewhere?
Yeah, perhaps there's not much that is being done that way. Although I see there are some steps that are being done by some groups. For example, I talked about the OA Organics, but apart from what they are doing, they're also looking at maybe restoring the environment in terms of helping them with reforestation. These are some of the things that perhaps we need to look at. But personally, I don't see it very much in terms of the church rising up to that. And within the indigenous communities themselves, they are just so concerned about livelihood at this point to just try and cope with things on the land. And so you need people from outside to come in to be advocates, as it were, to speak for them and help them along. I remember there were lawyers who actually, to give the right garb, as it were, give the legal name to things that they are actually fighting for, which they don't know how to fit it in the context of law, for example, or in the context of what is being done globally. And that's perhaps something that we can, that the church or NGOs can come and help them fight that battle, as it were. And if I may just say, also one of the problems with this is, although they know what they need, for a long time, indigenous peoples in this country have gone on this line, jangan lawan kerajaan, And so that with that ceiling, you dare not speak. Nobody dares speak something that seems to go against any of the policies. So that is perhaps where you need, again, advocates to come alongside them to speak where they are not able to, or give a voice to those who are not able to speak for themselves.
I'm going to go back to a general question to all of you and invite your response. It's about the question of what all of you are doing is very much at the coalface, at the grassroots level, and that certainly meets an immediate need. But the 5 marks of mission that Chris Wright has written about also talks about unjust structures. And so, Eugene or Audrey, Prof. Ramy in turn, where do you think, or what do you think can the average individual Christian or a Christian community or a Christian church or a Christian denomination, what can we do to bring about a more just society and to remove some of those unjust structures?
Well, in terms of national unity, now, of course, this is not trying to be critical of the church, but you talk about what can we do. The point, Andrew, you made about recently the government has released the what you call the Dasar Perpaduan and the Blueprint Perpaduan. This policy document did not just come overnight. Sometime in September, October last year, before the government actually came out with this policy document, they invited stakeholders actually to give responses, both orally, in meeting, as well as in written form. Unfortunately, this is not very good for the church, but I think it's something that I think the church can improve on is this. The church groups should actually think of opportunities, look at such opportunities, do not miss it because there's an open opportunity for you to do so, to actually give your views and your suggestions and input when you have this kind of platforms, this kind of forum. As I say, in terms of the National Unity Blueprint and the policy document, unfortunately, the church as a group did not do much of that, although I alerted the church group. So this is just a by way of example that there are from time to time what they call platforms or forums for the church to give their views or at least express their opinion. It may be just a very single issue kind of opinion or a dual or triple issue. It doesn't matter. But look for these opportunities to be able to express your views, give your input. At least you are on record as one as having given an input. So this is one way I think the church must be aware of. More needs to be done for them to be able to come together to contribute in a meaningful way to rectify unjust structures.
Thank you. Audrey, your thoughts on this institutional reform change?
All right, thanks. So I think that in terms of migration, right, it is a very sensitive issue, as we all know. And I think in regards to participation in unjust structures, in terms of, I guess, maybe policy making and things like that, there is a place in terms of migrants in Malaysia. For Muslim migrants, I would say there's more of a place because of our government, which is Islamic government. So there are platforms for that, and even among religious groups, Muslim religious groups. But I don't see a lot of that with Christian groups. But there are a lot of Christian migrants that we reach out to, we care for. So I think that similar to what Eugene was saying as well, giving our voice, participating in conversations, in interfaith platforms perhaps as well. That is still not very strong, I would say. I do see that there are different groups and some churches that are more involved. But I think I understand why there are churches that would try to stay away from that, I guess in fear of offending the government, or because they see their role more of caring for Christians, more of preaching the gospel and teaching. But I think there are parachurch organizations and platforms, just like Malaysia Care and others, that can facilitate the involvement of churches. Because, and I maybe a bit of a challenge to the question itself is, I understand that there is a need to address unjust structures. But I think if you want to be able to emphasize on this and also, I guess, not exclude people who are on a camp of just we need to preach the gospel, or we need to ultimately evangelism is first. We need to be able to put this together, right? Like even in Chris Wright's book, it is 5 marks, right? It is part of a greater picture of the gospel of bringing all creation under God's rule. I think they need to see that there is a cohesion, there's a relationship between these things. It's not just one camp or another, and that in doing these things, in participating in addressing unjust structures, in providing welfare for people and migrants, and in doing evangelism, it comes together as a whole, and that sort of I guess holistic view needs to happen, and so when we talk about addressing structures, I think we need to be able to give a background that ultimately, yes, it is not the structure itself. It's not that if you change the policies and things like that, everybody, but it is, in a way, it is the process also that will be able to point people to the gospel, and in doing so, we are also ultimately sharing God's gospel. Yeah.
Thank you. Prof. Ramy, your thoughts on this point?
I think this is a very real issue, especially for indigenous peoples in this country. unjust structures, the laws that are passed for indigenous peoples or on their lands is really very restrictive, restricting their claims. I mean, I gave you an example of the Aboriginal Peoples Act and policies that are unjust policies, and they just cannot rise above that. So the question is, can involvement of individuals or churches make any difference in that? Absolutely. I think a strong lobby group consisting perhaps of NGOs and politicians or individuals who understand the real needs of the indigenous peoples or the natives, Orang Asal and Orang Asli here, could get involved in really lobbying for those changes alongside the local people, whether they're from the church or not. And beginning with the creating awareness of those rights to actual lobbying for specific rights. For example, now where they're talking about wanting some kind of rights on the forest in which they live so that they can co-manage that. I mean, that's something, it goes against the laws that are there that controls them. But perhaps a move, I mean, Eugene talks about this GBM, which is a coalition of NGOs. Much of the rights that have been won by indigenous peoples internationally has been through NGOs working alongside them. So I think that's something that we can think about. And those people can come from within or without the church, working in collaboration. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you very much to all our three speakers, presenters, Eugene Yapp, Audrey Sito, and Professor Ramy Bulan. Can I just leave by reading a question, and maybe this is something that we can take away with us and think about it some more, and maybe even discuss it in our own Christian groups and churches. And it's the question goes this way, or the observation. I think there is also a need for churches to be self-reflective. We need to address our own perception of racism and prejudice, either external or internalized prejudice. I guess step one of resolving the problem should be an acknowledgement of the problem. So with that very thoughtful observation, I thank everyone for tuning in into this webinar, this session, and I hope that you'll continue to stay on for the next session and also for the two Chris Wright presentations later today. Thank you very much. God bless you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.